there. Welcome to English 112. This is our class for Thursday, the 2nd of February, where we are talking about writing about fiction and then finally beginning to read some fiction. So as you know, last class we talked about some of the elements that could be associated with fiction. And in fact, if you are using the textbook that I had assigned for our class, or at least the edition of the textbook I'd assigned for our class, you would notice that on page 47, and you can see this in the notes below the video as well, I have a list of questions about plot and character and setting and symbolism and theme and style and tone and irony and even critical strategies that I wanted to go through with you. Not that you should view this as a kind of checklist and that you should go through and answer each question, but keep these questions in the back of your mind as you are reading. Eventually you are going to be writing a journal where I'm going to ask you to select 3 of the short stories from our short story unit and to write about a page or so informally for each of those short stories. So these questions could be questions that you might want to examine in a journal. As you know, there are also discussion forum questions, and you could expand on one of those discussion forum questions or several of them for a journal as well. You're not required to respond to your classmates' responses, but you are required to read their responses and my responses in turn. So that would try to simulate the second part of the class, which would be class discussion. The first part of the class is the content part of the class, and these are my class videos where I'm sharing with you what I would talk about in class itself. So basically, watching the videos, of course doing the reading, and reading your classmates' discussion forum questions should try to simulate as much as possible what would occur in a live class. And as you know, as I indicated in Moodle, that I will be putting our past class sessions in a folder at the top of Moodle that says past class sessions, so that the homepage for our Moodle site will always access that particular week. And in terms of thinking about the writing about fiction section, on page 47, it divides it up into categories. And as you can see, there are quite a few categories for you to consider if you wanted to talk about writing about fiction. So for instance, just thinking about plot. Does the plot of the story conform to a formula? Does it follow particular criteria? We oftentimes talk about genre, which is a category of literature or a category of film. And oftentimes we think of genre writing as not having the same level of quality, the same level of depth or sophistication as other kinds of writing or film, because it does follow a formula. That said, you can certainly find works that are genre works and follow a formula and still have depth and sophistication. Probably Shakespeare's the best example that I can think of, that he wrote comedies and that followed a formula, and histories and tragedies and they too followed a formula, even tragic comedies and that followed a formula. But there's still creativity and there's still depth, there's still sophistication. What is the source and nature of the conflict? So there has to be some sort of conflict or issue, or else we wouldn't have interest in continuing our reading. And who is the protagonist, which is the main character? And it may be obvious, it may not necessarily be obvious. Is the story told chronologically? And if it's not told chronologically, there's probably a reason why for it. What does the exposition or the background information reveal to you? How is that given to you in the story? Especially with a short story where we get just a brief period of time. So how do we get background information that's necessary? Is the conflict resolved? It may not be. Is the plot unified? And then thinking about characters themselves, do you identify with the protagonist? And you may not, and that's perfectly fine. And who or what is the antagonist, which is basically the enemy or the person who is in opposition to the protagonist. And an antagonist need not be a person. It can be a thing. It can be an animal. I think of Jack London, a very famous writer, who oftentimes portrayed the weather as an antagonist. So something like a nor'easter could be considered to be an antagonist, a huge storm. Do your response to the characters change as you read? And if so, why? Are the characters round? And I'm not talking about their physical appearance. In other words, do they have multiple qualities? Are they flat? So basically, they just have one or two qualities. Or are they stock? In other words, stereotypical characters, something like the nosy neighbor. How does the author reveal information about the characters? And what's the purpose of the minor characters? Are they there purely as window dressing, almost like the extras in a movie? Or are they serving an additional purpose? Setting. That could be very important. In fact, any information that the author gives you probably is important. So if we're given information about the setting, it probably means something. Is the setting used symbolically? In other words, is it used representationally in order to suggest something else? And is the setting, as I suggested earlier, used as an antagonist? Point of view. Who's telling the story? That can be very, very important in terms of understanding the story. And it can change based on who's telling the story. Much like we use skills in everyday life when we talk with somebody to try to determine if that person is being truthful, to determine if that person is trustworthy, just to determine if that person has accurate perceptions. And they may or may not. And it would be the same in terms of the narrator of the story. So the narrator may or may not be reliable. The narrator may or may not be objective. Does the author directly comment on the action? Does the author break that fictional wall, so to speak? And if we were told the story from a different point of view, how would that change your perception of the story? Or symbolism, as I suggested, where something represents something else. Usually it's something abstract that is represented by something concrete. Take something like a flag, for instance, which is a concrete object that's supposed to represent something that is abstract, something like patriotism. Sometimes the symbolism is obvious because we have been taught this symbolism our entire lives. Sometimes not so obvious. We need to interpret. How do the symbols contribute to your understanding of this particular story? Or the theme. What is the major truth, or what are the major truths? I think that's probably better said, of this story. So what is the point or the points that are examined in this particular theme, in this particular piece? Is the theme stated directly? And it probably won't be. We talked about the idea that interpreting literature usually requires a certain level of effort. And is the theme a confirmation of your values, or does it challenge them? You don't have to agree with the theme. But what you do want to do is to be able to identify the theme before you decide if you agree with it or disagree with it. Style, tone, irony, that all has to do with the writing. Is the style consistent and appropriate throughout the text? The diction or the use of words. Is it formal? Is it informal? Does it change based on character? Is that realistic based on the language that the character is using? How does the author's use of language contribute to the tone or the feeling of the story? Is the story angry? Is it nostalgic? Is it humorous? And this goes to my definition of what literature is. Can you read it more than once and develop new interpretations? And I think that really is the distinction between a piece of writing, something like a newspaper article that you would read once for content. And once you've absorbed that content, there really isn't any need to reread it. There isn't kind of interpretation that's involved in that. As opposed to a piece of literature, a poem, let's say, that you could read hundreds, perhaps even thousands of times and find new meaning. Think about how many centuries have gone by with Shakespeare, and there are still readers who find new meaning within his text. Critical strategies, because we talked about this a little bit, that there are different lenses or viewpoints from which you can examine a piece of literature. And I didn't go through that list so that you could determine that you happen to be a follower of, let's say, biographical criticism. So everything you're going to read is going to be based on the author's biography. Instead, I just wanted you to know that they existed, and you let the reading determine for you whether or not it's appropriate to focus on biography, or perhaps it would be more appropriate to focus on psychology based on the reading and based on your personal interests as well. But certainly knowing something about the author's biography is probably helpful. And the text will oftentimes give us a little bit of information about biography. Just as knowing something about the history of the time period, it's incredibly important that we know when the story is taking place and we know when the story was written. That goes the same with drama and with poetry and also with novel. Not that we're reading a novel, because that gives you a sense of time. Remember, that piece was written for its time, not for us. What kinds of evidence from the story are you focusing on? Many times, individuals who are thinking about entering law school will take English classes or even major in English because you utilize many of the same skills. A good lawyer can represent either side of a courtroom. And it's the same evidence, but the lawyer is picking and choosing which pieces of evidence to present. And you know the importance of having a good lawyer, because a good lawyer is able to see nuances that perhaps a poor lawyer wouldn't be able to do. So they could take weaker evidence and make it appear stronger. Or they can also take stronger evidence and make it appear weaker if they're a good lawyer. And it's the same with literary interpretation. You are picking and choosing the pieces of evidence in order to support your particular position. You aren't writing about facts. You're writing about, in your thesis, a position upon which reasonable people could disagree. And you are trying to support that position with reference to the text, both paraphrase, in other words, using your own language to talk a little bit about the text, as well as quotation that would help to strengthen your particular argument. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And to what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions influence your interpretation? We all have bias, so there's no way to eliminate bias. What's important is to at least acknowledge that we have bias and understand how it might influence our interpretation. And again, given that there are multiple ways to interpret a story, sometimes they can even contradict one another, and both of them can be equally valid. Which interpretation seems most useful to you and why? So, on page 50, you're given a sample paper in progress, and I view it as kind of like in between a journal and in between a paper. It's much more formal than what you would do with a journal because it's got complete sentences and paragraphs, and it's quite polished. In fact, for your journal, you can use just bullet points if you wanted to, because I'm not evaluating for grammar or mechanics, just for content. But if you read the example of the journal, you'll see that the content really is appropriate for a journal and not for a paper. The author is writing about in their journal the response of family members to the literature that they read, how their father responded to it, how their grandmother responded to it. And while that would be perfectly fine for a journal because it's informal, not for a paper. The paper should be about how you responded, not about how your family members responded. And if your family members really wanted to respond, then they should enroll in the class and write their own papers. And it also talks about writing a sample paper in progress, that oftentimes you can use elements from a journal to springboard into a topic for a paper. And that's my hope that will happen with you this semester. Not that it's required that you write a paper based on what you decide to write a journal about. That you brainstorm, that rather than trying to write the perfect paper hours before it's due, that's really not the best way to write. You'll end up usually with a weaker product. You just try to come up with ideas that you are writing down in no particular order. You don't worry about grammar, and you don't worry about mechanics or any of that. And then finally, you go into a drafting stage where you begin to formulate sentences. And then finally, the editing, which is where you do polishing, and then the submission. But as I indicated, we'll talk a little bit more about this as well. So this was the first section in the notes below about writing about fiction. So the second section is on formula fiction, or sometimes it's known as genre writing. That how do we determine quality in a piece of literature? Something that has depth and sophistication, something that's worth time for academic analysis. What makes it into the canon? Those works considered by scholars and critics worthy of academic study. And formulaic fiction, because it follows a formula, and because it's usually written primarily for entertainment and primarily for profit, is usually not considered to be worthy of academic study. not to say there's anything wrong with trying to generate profit from your work, though if you ask any true artists, they'll tell you that while they certainly want to generate profit from their music or from their paintings or from their writing, they would produce anyway because of the need to create. And it also is formulaic, and there's nothing wrong with following a formula because that's what your audience expects. Think about when you're going to see a film and there is a genre called rom-com or the romantic comedy, and you have certain expectations that it's going to be about love, there will be conflict associated with that love, and there will be a happy resolution. And if you don't have those characteristics, well, then you want your money back, because you would have seen another genre if you had known that that genre wouldn't have necessarily been following your expectations. And it goes the same with sci-fi, with horror, with westerns. The textbook just happens to focus on Harlequin romances, but it could have focused on any kind of genre. Now, that said, I've indicated that I'm interested in medium popular culture, and I think anything can be studied from an academic perspective, even something like a television commercial, which I do in my media classes. But they were not intended for that purpose. That certainly we can examine these in terms of their commentary about society, about what we value and what we don't value. But there probably isn't a depth or a sophistication of writing or message in that particular piece. Usually it's not only formulaic, but predictable and trite. And again, it usually doesn't require much effort from the reader, which is perfectly fine if you've had a long day and you want some escapism. That said, the kind of works that we will be devoting our semester to aren't those kind of works. You really do have to put attention into them. And again, I had indicated they used the example of a Harlequin romance, though they could have used any of a number of examples. And on page 26 of the edition of the textbook that I had ordered, they talk about the rules, and there are quite a few, and they're quite strict, that you would have to follow if you wanted to write in the genre or category of Harlequin romance. It's called the composite romance tip sheet. There are rules about plot. It has to focus on the growing relationship between the heroine and the hero, and after a number of complications, they discover lasting love. Note that the assumption is that this is a heterosexual relationship. Love is the major interest. Don't inject other topics such as murder or extortion or hijacking or anything else. The love should be complicated by some sort of misunderstanding, but the reader knows what the characters don't, that they will indeed overcome their obstacles and have a happy ending. Heroine, and she should reflect the modern American woman between the ages of 19 and 28, because those are the ages that are considered the prime for female. So whether or not the reader is female, though the demographic for romance novels is oftentimes female, or whether or not the reader falls into that age demographic of 19 to 28 is irrelevant, because there's a certain level of escapism here. So you want to fantasize. And again, at least according to society, 19 and 28 is usually the years that we view as the height of a female's life. The story is told in the third person from her point of view. Again, the average reader of a Harlequin would be female, so you would want to have it told from the heroine's point of view. She's attractive, nicely dressed, but not glamorous. Glamour is reserved for the other woman who compares unfavorably. The heroine's personality is spirited and independent, but not pushy or stubborn. So you have to strike a fine balance here. She's self-reliant and also vulnerable at the same time. Common careers, things like nurse and teacher and interior designer, assistant manager, department store buyer, travel expert, struggling photographer. No menial work, because that's what the reader is probably trying to escape from. She can also be a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, but it can't dominate her life because, again, the focus is supposed to be on her personal life, specifically her love relationship, not her career. And while she's allowed to drink in moderation, she never drinks alone. Again, you can't have any kind of chronic problems, alcoholism, drug abuse, for any of these characters, or at least for the heroine and the hero. The hero should be about 10 years older than the heroine, so not too much older, but a little bit older, so he's more experienced. And he can be foreign or American. I always say sarcastically, how generous. He needn't be handsome in a traditional sense, but he must be strongly masculine, tall and well built, usually dark. He looks terrific in a three-piece suit, just like he does in sports clothes, and his clothes reflect good taste and an affluent lifestyle. Again, economic problems would not be an issue in the world of escapism with Harlequin romance. And he might have some sort of painful moment that's shrouded in mystery, perhaps a wife's previous death or a divorce. It's not his fault, because again, we want him to be attractive as a lover and as a mate, with no chronic problems such as alcoholism, drug addiction, sexual dysfunction. You get the rest. You get the idea of the rest. And secondary characters are just that. They're merely secondary. They're there to serve as window dressing, if you will. The other woman, she's supposed to be in contrast to our heroine. The other man, who usually falls into one of two types. The decent sort, who is there when the hero isn't around, or some kind of selfish individual who's scheming and plotting and planning. And then there are other characters who, again, might serve as like the extras in a movie. The setting is supposed to be contemporary, romantic, and exciting. So places like New York, London, Paris, Rio, the mountains, the ocean. My suggestion or suspicion, perhaps both, is that Greenfield, Massachusetts might not necessarily be the first thought of setting. That said, marriage may take the heroine and hero to a pretty suburb or small town, such as Greenfield. Love scenes? Yes, they can make love before marriage, but you don't want to be too graphic, and neither is promiscuous. That's another genre. That's called porn. And we know that has rules to it as well. Description should appeal to the senses, but not be overly detailed or graphic. And no coarse language, though hell or damn might be all right. Writing. This is what makes my heart sad. Avoid complex sentences, long paragraphs, lengthy descriptions. Use concise, vivid details to create the heroine's world. Be sure to include full descriptions of the hero's and heroine's physical features and clothes. Allow the reader to experience the romantic mood. In other words, you shouldn't have to work hard when you're reading to try to determine what's happening. Dialogue should sound like ordinary conversation. The ordinary writing should be contemporary, without slang or difficult foreign expressions, or strange dialects or racial epithets, or obscenities, though I had said mild swears like hell or damn are okay. What makes my heart even sadder is that there's even criteria for length. The length should be 55,000 to 65,000 words in 10 to 12 paragraphs, or 10 to 12 chapters, I'm sorry. And I always think of this when students ask me how long should my paper be, and the sarcastic part of me wants to answer, well, it needs to be as long as it needs to be. Can you imagine telling Picasso how many colors to use in his painting? Now, I understand when a student is asking about length, what they're really asking about is how much effort should I put into this paper. And there certainly is a difference between a 2-page paper and an 8-page paper. But that said, if you are writing creatively, then ultimately you write, or even from a literary analysis standpoint, which is why I always give suggestions of how long your paper should be, but I always say it should be as long as it needs to be in order to be able to prove your point. But can you imagine telling somebody who's writing a novel how many words they should use and how many chapters they should have? It completely takes away any kind of originality or creativity. But if you've heard the old expression that it's better to show rather than tell, well then, we have 2 examples in the textbook to show the distinction, the difference between something that's formulaic and usually is not considered to be a piece of literature worthy of academic study, as opposed to something that has much more depth and much more complexity. So now we're finally entering into the realm of reading some of the literature. Up to now, it's been basically introduction, and certainly you can reference any of this in any of your journals or any of your discussion forum questions. But as far as I'm concerned, the literature begins now, the literary analysis. And while it's certainly important to read everything, it's especially important to read these particular pieces of literature. The good news, however, is that I've been able to find links online that you can reference for these pieces of literature. And that said, certainly you need to do all of the reading, but if it turns out that you don't yet have access to the textbook, which is on reserve at the GCC library, by the way, you can always go to these links. And you can see that their two stories have very similar kinds of titles: A Secret Sorrow and A Sorrowful Woman. And that said, I think you can see with A Secret Sorrow, which happens to be an excerpt from a Harlequin romance, so it's not even a short story that stands on its own, how it is very formulaic and predictable and trite and not very creative. If nothing else, the fact that we can summarize a novel in just a few sentences so that ultimately we can jump in to the last chapters, which is what we do when we read A Secret Sorrow. We jump immediately into chapter 11 and chapter 12. So we're given a brief summary of the first 10 chapters, and we can understand everything that's going on. The writing is quite melodramatic. Faye could feel the blood. This is the first paragraph. Faye could feel the blood drain from her face. It's on page 31 if you are using the edition of the text I ordered. And for one horrifying moment, she thought she was going to faint right in Kai's arms. The room tilted. Everything swirled around in a wild madman's dance. She clutched at him for support, fighting for control, trying to focus at some point beyond his shoulder. Slowly, everything steadied. A lot of dialogue, not that that's necessarily a bad thing. We'll talk about this when we get to Ernest Hemingway, who also uses a lot of dialogue. But dialogue is usually easier to read than exposition, so that Ernest Hemingway, more often than not, tends to be a reader favorite. But we'll see that even though he uses a lot of dialogue, and it might sound like simple dialogue, there's a great level of depth and complexity to it that we just don't see in this piece. And in fact, I can summarize it for you if you haven't read it. Basically, Faye and Kai are a couple. She wants to leave him because she has found out that she is infertile and she's not able to have children. He says, don't leave me. She says, I have to. He says, don't leave me. She says, I have to. He says, don't leave me. She says, I have to. He says, we'll adopt. She says, really? He says, yes. She says, okay. They adopt and live happily ever after. And I'm not exaggerating much when I say that chapter 10 and chapter 11 basically runs that way. So, not to in any way demean the conflicts or to belittle these two individual characters or any couple that is experiencing this very difficult issue of infertility. But the fact that it could be solved in just a few minutes is what makes it so unrealistic. So this is the example of that which is formulaic and predictable and trite and probably is not worth much of our attention. That said, Harlequin romances have been studied by feminist critics, in particular to talk a little bit about the way that female, specifically, is portrayed and some of the stereotypes associated with female. And from that perspective, from perhaps a sociological perspective, you could do some interesting work. Soap operas have also been examined that way. But in terms of a literary analysis, I don't really think that there's much there. So what we should expect when we're reading a piece of literature is that it's not written primarily for profit, though again, it doesn't necessarily have to be completely out of the generosity of one's heart. What oftentimes happens with artists is that their work becomes much more valuable upon their death because now there's a limited amount of work. And it's one of the reasons why literature oftentimes stands the test of time, and that we're reading pieces of literature that are quite old, that have been valued generation after generation. It's not predictable. It's not formulaic. It's not trite. You usually can't guess what's going to happen. It's usually not classified by a genre, but once we get to Shakespeare, we'll talk about how he breaks all the rules, including genres. There are no strict rules for how to construct the plot or to develop the characters, or where to put the setting, or how to do love scenes, or the kind of writing, or even the length. So we're focused on short story, which is a brief piece of fiction. I can't give you necessarily a particular length and tell you that if it's 12 pages, it's a short story. If it's 13 pages, it's not a short story. I mean, sometimes you know it when you see it. There is a term called novella, which is something that's longer than a short story, but not quite as long as a novel. But usually we define a short story not just in terms of its brevity, but also that it's dealing with a single incident. And this is what we see when we are reading A Sorrowful Woman. And we will see with all of the literature that follows. So basically, from now until we get to our drama section, we are going to be reading pieces of literature that are part of the canon, that are considered to be by scholars and critics worthy of academic study. And if you would look down into our notes below, you'll see section 5. I've listed several things for you to consider, that you should consider whenever you're reading a piece of literature. The author, who wrote this work. And the textbook will oftentimes give you a brief biography of the author, but oftentimes you can tell information about the author based on the dates of the text. And also based on the name, you might be able to determine gender, though that isn't always the case. The dates, again, a piece of writing may not necessarily be set in the date in which it was written. You can set a story in the past or in the future. If you aren't given information about the timeline of the story, you can assume that it is contemporary to its time of writing. And you'll see that I took the time on our course outline to indicate both the author and the date in which the piece was published. The title. Titles can be very important. If you've ever gone through naming something, whether it be a child, a pet, even a possession, you know that sometimes it can be happenstance, but more often than not, it's got a certain level of meaning and significance to it. I always use the example of a film that really is misviewed and misread. The Exorcist, that you might be familiar with, which people will maintain is the story of a young girl who is possessed by a demon. But look at the title. It's not about the girl. It's about the exorcist. Actually, there's two. The two priests who basically fight the demon. And once you read the novel, it was initially based on a novel, or view the film from that lens, the film and the novel become much more interesting. So look at the title. The title will oftentimes give you a clue. I know more often than not, we're tempted to likely skip these things, like the name of the author, or the date, or the title, because we want to get into the story itself. And I had indicated that ideally you would give 3 readings to a piece of literature. The first for plot, what's happening. The second for analysis, in other words, interpretation. And the third, shortly before you're going to discuss it or before you are going to write about it, just to refresh your memory. I understand that's not always possible, but do know that each rereading brings additional meaning. So when a student says something like, I've read this before, then that means that student has an advantage. They already know the plot, so they can do much more detailed work than somebody who's just beginning. But you have to start someplace with your first reading. But you could have 100 readings, and each one should bring additional level of subtlety and nuance to it. The plot, of course, you need to know what's happening, or else you're not going to be able to write about the piece. But what's more important is not what is happening, but why those things are happening in the plot. Talking about the characters. Who are the characters? And thinking about even things like the characters' names, because they oftentimes have significance. What is the setting or the settings? Again, if we're not given this information, it's probably not important. But if we are given this information, it probably means something. The use of language. Again, these are very similar to the questions that I just reviewed earlier. The theme or themes within the text. The ending. Endings can be particularly important. Short stories oftentimes end with a twist ending, known as frisson in French. The idea that you've got the twist, something that was unexpected. Important quotes. Not every quote, not every piece of language is going to be important. So which are the important quotes and why? At the ending of these works, you're going to be given questions. And those questions can help direct your reading. Sometimes students like to read the questions before they actually do the reading. Also, you might want to do the questions after you've done the reading because you don't want spoilers. Or some of these questions might give you ideas for things that you could write about in a journal or perhaps even eventually in a paper. Your questions. You're allowed to have questions, and as I said, I believe in the first class, sometimes the questions are more interesting than the answers. So we may not necessarily get a neat and tidy answer. So when we read the second story, A Sorrowful Woman, this is on page 39, but you'll see I've also included a web link for it. Very different kind of piece in that right from the very beginning, we probably have questions because we are presented with an opening line. Once upon a time, there was a wife and mother, one too many times. In fact, that's going to be today's attendance question that will be due 48 hours from now. So if you're watching this on Thursday, that'll be due on Saturday at noon. And the question is, which you can see at the bottom of our notes, and you can just click on the discussion form for that question. You don't have to start a new thread. Why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening statement? And that actually has a word that it's called epigraph, when a piece begins with an opening statement. That reads, quote, once upon a time there was a wife and mother, one too many times. And of course, when you are first reading, you won't know the answer to that. You need to read the entire text to begin to try to figure out what the answer is. And it may not necessarily be clear. You might have to do some interpretations. You might need to do multiple readings before you can answer that question. Of course, the first reading is about plot. And we can see that this piece was published in 1971. So this gives us a sense of time period. And as you can see in the notes below, the women's rights movement was particularly important in 1971. And since Gail Godwin, the author, is a female author, I would suggest that could be important. And as we read the story, we will find out it is important because we have a central female character. And you can see that I've got a bunch of notes below that I'm going to be addressing next class about things that you could consider, such as the A in the title. Instead of The Sorrowful Woman, it's A Sorrowful Woman. And these are the kinds of details that I will go through with you because I'm cognizant of the time and I don't want our videos to run too long. But this is the point where you need to keep up with the reading. So definitely read A Sorrowful Woman. You have to read A Sorrowful Woman so that you can answer today's attendance question of why you think the text begins with once upon a time there was a wife and mother, one too many times. Again, you don't necessarily need to have a right answer. We'll talk about all of the possibilities of what that means next class. But I'd like you to grapple with that. And again, if you feel kind of lost, there are some hints or clues of things that I will be talking about next class in the notes below. But again, I will expand and develop upon them when we continue our conversation next week. And talking about some of the texts that we will be doing next week. Not only will we talk about A Sorrowful Woman, but we have a short story called The Story of an Hour that was in the initial set of readings, but I wanted us to read that as a separate or independent unit, as well as a short story called A Rose for Emily. And again, all of those have the page numbers as well as the online links that I was able to find for the stories. And quite interestingly, for Rose for Emily, I have an interview from the author talking a little bit about his perspective. So we may not necessarily get to all of these short stories next class, but it's always a good idea to do the reading ahead of time because if we don't get to it next class, we'll get to it the following class. So again, why do you think A Sorrowful Woman begins with the opening statement or epigraph that reads, quote, once upon a time there was a wife and mother, one too many times. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week, as well as continue to talk about upcoming assignments such as journals. Take care. Bye bye.